Hi guys, today we're going to finish up our Acropolis notes and you're going to take notes on these two pages. On my notebook, they're pages 37 and 38, and you should have already done the rest of the video questions using the second Acropolis video. So yesterday we talked about the Parthenon and went into detail on the outside of the Parthenon, and then you watched the video about the sculptures of the Parthenon. We also talked about the path that the Athenians followed on their way up to the Acropolis, called the Panathenaic procession, which was this procession that they had for a religious festival honoring the goddess Athena. We also talked about Doric and Ionic columns. So the columns on the outside of the Parthenon are Doric. Ionic columns are recognizable by the scrolls. Here's the recreation of the statue of Athena, and I like the picture on the left because it shows how monumental it probably was compared to a human. So that was inside the Parthenon. We looked briefly at the Erechtheion, which is an Ionic building that was off to the side from the Parthenon that held the wooden statue of Athena. And now the first picture on your notes for today is this one. This is called the Plaque of the Ergostines. This is a required image. So College Board tells the teachers and puts in the curriculum that they put out, these are the images the students must know. And this is one of the ones they've chosen to represent the Acropolis. So what is this? This is a fragment of the frieze that goes all the way around the Acropolis, representing probably the Panathenaic procession. So this is the frieze that's under the colonnade, where like you walk through the first set of columns and you look up and you would see this. It's about 3 feet tall, and remember, it would have been very brightly painted. It would have been very high up. So you walk under the first set of columns and then you have to turn your head and look up, and it's way, way above you. There are differing opinions on what this represents, but the most popular is that it represents the Panathenaic procession. And it talked about that, I believe, in the video, where they brought a peplos to clothe Athena, which is that garment that women wore, and they brought animals for sacrifice. But the people here are supposed to be real people, real humans, whereas the sculptures on all the rest of the Parthenon are of mythical beings, gods and goddesses and other mythical creatures. So like the pediments, the metopes have only mythical people. These are actual humans, which is kind of interesting because if you were creating a temple to your most important goddess, but then you kind of put yourself on it, that definitely says something about how you view yourself. In the people on the frieze, there's definitely a sense of reverence and dignity, that this is like an important religious festival and not just like a big party or something. Another thing to note is the drapery. So in the video, it talked about the drapery of the sculptor Phidias and how he had this wet drapery technique. We see kind of a similar thing here, where this drapery is just so intricate and deeply carved, and it has many, many more folds than drapery would really have if this was a real person's clothing. We also see an element of naturalism, and a term I'm going to teach you is contrapposto. So this guy in the middle right here, he is standing in a pose that we call contrapposto. This means when you have your weight on one leg and the other leg is relaxed or bent. And this is pretty much how people naturally stand. So we talked about how Anavisos Koros and King Menkari, they were standing equally on both legs. It was very stiff and unnatural. This is more how people really stand, contrapposto, where if you're standing, you'd probably like shift your weight back and forth between your legs. So that's an important element of naturalism. And we don't know exactly what is going on in this particular scene, because we have women who seem to be traveling forward, but then we have men that are turned around towards them. What is the interaction between them? We really don't know. But it is interesting because we know that women and men outside of their family were not really supposed to interact. Like women weren't even really allowed to go out in Athens without their male guardian. So what's happening here, we don't know. but it probably is part of the Panathenaic procession. All right, this one is part of the pediment showing the birth of Athena. So they talked about this in the video. This is another one of those required images that College Board wants you to know. So this is from the East Pediment, and it shows the horse and gods and goddesses, probably, they think, reacting to the birth of Athena. And like they talked about in the video, there's debate about who they actually are. There's theories about it. But if you just know that they're gods and goddesses reacting to the birth of Athena, and that this is from the East Pediment, which is all about the birth of Athena, that would be good. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Temple of Athena Nike. So Nike means victory. So that's what this temple was made for, to celebrate the victory of Athena and the Athenians over the Persians. This temple, you can see, remember we talked about the Parthenon, how it has, Parthenon has columns all the way around, and we call that a peristyle. This type where you have columns only on the front and the back, you have like a front porch and a back porch, is called an amphiprostyle. And so I wrote that word on the screen, amphiprostyle. So that again is when you have columns only on the front and the back. This also has, originally had, a little wall here. So you can see that in the illustration. There's this little wall, which was really just to, it's like a guardrail so that people don't just fall off this high Acropolis. That wall is called a parapet. So you might want to add a text box to your notes or some kind of label that this little wall is a parapet. Why is that important? Because that is where the sculpture, Nike adjusting her sandal, was found. So you can see in the illustration, there would be sculpture on this little wall and how none of that is there. That's where this sculpture was from. Okay, this celebrated, I said celebrated victory over the Persians. And a lot of these sculptures actually show the victory of the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. And it is an Ionic building. So you can see that it has the columns with the scrolls at the top. So this is an Ionic building. And let's look at more detail at this particular sculpture. This is also a required image for AP Art History. It is titled Nike Adjusting Her Sandal, and again, it's from the parapet that went around the Temple of Athena Nike. So a couple things to point out here. This definitely has that same technique of the sculptor Phidias, where it almost looks like her clothing is wet, like it's drenched and it's sticking to her body. And there are so many folds in the fabric that there's more folds than would really probably be in fabric if it got wet. But think again, I keep saying this, but think about this being carved out of solid stone and how that could even be accomplished and the work that would go into that to make it look so realistic and like it was actually wet. She is leaning down to adjust her sandal. That's what the title says. It could be also that she is taking off her sandal. And we learned that when people take off their shoes or are barefoot in artwork, a lot of times it's suggesting that they're walking on a holy place or sacred ground. Now, if you were here, I would have you try to do this pose. That's what I normally have my students do. And you would find that this is not a pose you can just hold. Okay, so we have like a snapshot of her doing this, but this is not something that you could actually easily do in real life for more than a couple seconds. And so Athena has wings, because Victory has wings, and you can see part of one wing here behind her. And so it's kind of suggesting that the wings are actually helping her be able to achieve this pose. There's also a lot of eroticism here. So the fact that Athena almost looks like her clothing is wet, and we see very clearly the outline of her body underneath her clothing is not a mistake. So if you think it has some like sex appeal here, then you're right. That is part of what the statue was probably trying to do. And I just think it's amazing how the sculptor was able to capture, like, look at how it looks like she really has a leg under this fabric and how much how far we've come in Greek art from when we looked at like the Orientalizing and the Archaic to now the High Classical period.